Welcome to Independent Sources. I'm Viano Ravinka.
And I'm Garry Pierre-Pierre. Since his win on November 4th, we've been looking at some of the major foreign policy challenges President Barack Obama will face when he takes office in January.
On this edition of Independent Sources, we focus on Afghanistan. Obama has said he'll make the war-torn country a central front in his war on terrorism. We'll look at a lawsuit filed against the NYPD that raises questions about credentials and the definition of a journalist. And we'll tell you about another lawsuit pending against the police, this one in Newark, New Jersey.
But first, Afghanistan. The foreign policy issues facing the new president and what this could mean for that country. Joining us from San Francisco is Fariba Nawa, a journalist who has lived in Afghanistan and covered that country for news organizations like the Sunday Times of London and National Public Radio. Welcome.
Thank you.
Fariba, President-elect Obama and President Karzai spoke on the phone. What do you think they talked about?
Well, I'm sure Afghanistan was one of the things that they spoke about, and I'm not sure what the tone of the conversation may have been other than cordial, but I think that Afghanistan is a major issue facing the United States right now.
Afghanistan has been criticizing Pakistan for its porous border and allowing extremists to come into Afghanistan. Now, with Obama saying that the focus of the war on terror would be Afghanistan and Pakistan, are there any hopes in Afghanistan that the Obama presidency will help soothe the relations between Afghanistan and Pakistan?
There are a lot of different issues around border relations, but the main problem right now is security for both countries. And I think imposing some sort of peace agreement, an agreement with the Taliban and the insurgency, is what President-elect Obama needs to do. How we're going to be able to do that is very challenging, and I think that we need to focus more on reconstruction in Afghanistan, on finding people jobs, on making sure that they feel safe.
Now, Fariba, some of the things you're talking about sounds like nation building. And we know that the Bush administration was not much into nation building. Would the Obama administration more likely get into that situation? And does that contradict the idea of increasing military presence in Afghanistan? How do you reconcile the two of them?
I don't believe that troops should be taken out, but I also don't think increasing troops and continuing the same military strategy that we're on right now is going to improve the situation.
Why not? Hasn't the insurgency by the Taliban increased recently, and why an increase in troops is not perceived as being beneficial to the country?
Because they're fighting a guerrilla warfare. They're fighting suicide bombers. So having more troops is really not going to help the problem. I mean, the issue is not about more troops. The issue is about gaining the public's trust. You have more and more people starting to support the Taliban because they see that as a better option now.
It's a problem with the government, right? So it's a problem of trust with Karzai.
It's a problem with trust with Karzai. It's a problem of government. It's also, yes, I think the insurgency has been successful because the Afghan people have stopped trusting the government. If you were to go back to 2003 and 2002, when the Taliban were first ousted, the Afghan people were very happy to see that. The type of lifestyle that they imposed on people was not welcome. They refused to let women go to work. They refused to let women go to school. There was really no intellectual life, no economic life in Afghanistan other than the poppy trade. And that's where the problem came in. And they had no international recognition outside of the UAE and Pakistan. So, and then they welcomed Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. Came September 11, and the U.S. asked the Taliban to oust bin Laden. They refused, and the U.S. attacked with its allies.
I just want to close with this question. What do you expect of the elections next year? Will Karzai survive? Really quick answer.
I don't know. It's hard to predict that kind of election. He's not very popular right now, that's for sure.
And we'll have to leave it at that. Fariba Nawa, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now here's Abi Ishola with some other news.
Thanks, Leonora. Here's a look at some headlines from New York's ethnic media. From El Diario La Prensa, 4 Democratic state senators formed an independent caucus during the elections to pull for Latinos to have more power in the Senate. Senator Ruben Diaz told El Diario La Prensa that blacks continue to benefit from the Hispanic vote, but haven't been supportive of Hispanic leaders. From New America Media, an increasing number of senior citizens throughout the country are coming out of retirement to look for work, but many are having a hard time finding employment amidst the bleak job market. The National Newspaper Publishers Association reports that Richard Dick Parsons of President-elect Obama's Economic Advisory Board said black-owned businesses would also reap the benefits of the financial bailout. This despite the fact that the plan seems to focus more on major corporations and the automotive industry. From the Haitian Times, the UN is looking to strengthen business for farmers in the Dominican Republic. The UN International Fund for Agricultural Development will invest $31 million in small farmers' organizations on the island to make it easier for them to trade with consumers. The Jewish Forward reports that a record 45 Jews will take the oath of office for Congress in January. 13 Jews will be part of the Senate, and 32 will be part of the House of Representatives. This includes Jarrett Polis of Colorado, the first openly gay non-incumbent male to be elected to the House. Yale has made the largest investment by a university towards the study of India and South Asia. India Abroad reports that the Ivy League University has committed $75 million towards the new project called the Yale India Initiative. The goal is to increase the school's visibility and connection with India. And finally, World Journal reports that a recent survey of Chinatown and Flushing, Queens residents show that more Chinese Americans spend a greater portion of their income on rent than native-born Americans, but live in poorer living conditions. Those are just a few headlines from New York's ethnic media. Back to you, Leonora.
Thanks, Abby. The question of who is a journalist is at the center of a lawsuit 3 men recently filed against the New York City Police Department. They were denied press credentials issued by the NYPD. To discuss the case and the issue of access to coverage, we're joined by Normal Siegel, a civil liberties lawyer who is representing the 3 men, and Steve Handelman, director of the Center on Media, Crime and Justice at John Jay College. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
And before we talk about these issues, let's look at this report by producer Anjanette Levert.
Longtime City Hall gadfly Rafael Martinez-Alequín has more than 25 years working as a journalist. And for more than 15 years, he has carried a working press card.
Suddenly, that in 2007, they changed everything here. Before, we used to go bring 3 articles that have been written within the year, a letter from the publisher, in that case was me, they would take a photograph and issue instantly the press credential to everybody.
But last year, the NYPD started requiring journalists to make appointments to receive their credentials.
I went there and then they denied my press credential.
Mr. Alequín is suing the NYPD to have his credentials reinstated. He believes he has received this treatment because of the tough questions he asked Mayor Bloomberg.
This mayor, who is a media mogul, the reason he denied it to me because I do ask questions pertaining to the policy that is made in the city that affect the poor people, the community, whether they be Afro-American, Puerto Rican, the other Latinos or Afro or Asian.
Alequín is not alone in his lawsuit. He is joined by Ralph E. Smith, publisher of the Guardian Chronicle, and by David Wallace, the founder of FeatureWell.com. They also were denied working press credentials in 2007 without explanation. The city's law department issued a statement saying, the issuance of NYPD press passes strikes an appropriate balance between First Amendment concerns and public safety. Their lawsuit asserts that the system for issuing press credentials is inconsistent and constitutionally flawed. That same opinion is also held by the immigrant and ethnic media. Last September, New York Community Media Alliance and the NYPD met. Deputy Commissioner for Public Information, Paul Browne, floated the idea of the NYPD getting out of the press pass business.
What would you think of our just getting out of the business entirely of press credentials, license plates, everything? We're out of it. And we're just going to close a crime scene based purely on investigative need. And then reporters, you know, you're from a big newspaper, you're a little newspaper, you're from a website, doesn't make any difference. You're just like anybody else.
For now, Alequín's concern is that the press card is needed for more than just crime scenes, and it is access that he's fighting for.
But the lawsuit is not about Rafael Martinez-Alequín or Ralph Smith or David Wallace. More important than that is the denier of the freedom of the press, the denier of the right on the First Amendment to journalists.
Anjanette Levert for Independent Sources.
Norman, you've been involved in civil rights cases in over 30 years. Is this the first time you're suing the NYPD over press credential? And if so, why is this such an important issue?
It is the first time on that issue. I've sued the NYPD on a lot of other issues. This is an important civil rights issue because it raises the question, as the intro said, who is a journalist in the 21st century? And more important, who makes that decision? What criteria, if any, are employed? And as we looked at it, it appeared that the system in New York City for granting press credentials run by the New York Police Department had run amok, and that we need to make some changes immediately. The 3 journalists were getting press credentials for years, and then starting in 2007, it appeared that there was a change at the NYPD where people were not getting their press credentials. The regulations and the procedure for how to apply, if you were turned down, your right to appeal, the right to have a hearing and get a decision, the NYPD was not even following their own rules and regulations. And then there are some elements of the regulations where they talk about legitimate news organization. What is a legitimate news organization? And again, who makes that decision? And most important, why the NYPD? There's a lot of tension historically between the police and journalists. Why isn't the Consumer Affairs, who gives out licenses in the city of New York for many things, why aren't they the agency that's making that decision? So I think this is an important issue, and what we've also found out is a lot of journalists who are online, bloggers, are having difficulty in 2008 getting press credentials, and it looks like the city of New York doesn't know what to do about the 21st century technology called online.
And Steve, in the new media world, who is a journalist?
Well, that's a really good question, because I don't think even journalists themselves can answer it. But what I find really interesting about this issue, and the one that Norman is bringing to court, is that the NYPD itself is not really clear about what it wants. A year ago, Paul Browne, who's the Deputy Commissioner of Information, actually floated at a conference we had the idea that maybe we don't need press credentials at all. And this in fact was at a meeting with ethnic media journalists in New York, and he said, I'm just breaking this out just in case anybody's interested and wants to respond. And I think the journalists there were a bit stunned, because a lot of them were having the same issues that Norm is talking about. People self-define as journalists. It's probably the thorniest question in journalism. Who is a journalist? Who has the right to say who is a journalist? And very often it's not just the authorizing organization that has a problem, because journalists themselves are a very clubby lot, and they have been for years and years and years. So they also find it a little bit difficult to accept new media or new journalists in their closed club. And that, it's just as uncomfortable for your daily working stiff, who works for the Daily News, who works for the New York Times, to accept that somebody who doesn't quite publish every day or doesn't do something that you can see every day is on the same level and the same status as he or she is.
The courts have said, in answer to the definition of journalist, is she or he who gathers information and communicates it to the public is a journalist. And the courts have said it's not limited to print. And when TV came in the 40s, they had problems getting press credentials. And I think that the 21st century technology of bloggers and online communication is presenting problems for cities like New York City, and hopefully our clients will get their press credentials, and then we can all sit down, Steve, others, the NYPD, and begin to develop some rules and regulations that make sense for the 21st century.
Steve, one point I wanted to ask you is, how did the NYPD get into this business?
That's a very good question. I think that's the heart of the question: is who actually issued? What are press credentials for? I mean, I had NYPD press credentials when I was a reporter in New York City. And aside from the perks that you used to get, which is that if you had a card, you could put plates on, you could park anywhere. And the main thing that it got you was you were able to cross police lines in an accident or in a crime scene.
Within a certain perimeters, of course.
Within a certain perimeter. And that seemed to be status enough. I mean, you had the old fire chasers who loved to be at every crime scene. But that's a lot more than the justification for giving a press credential now. I mean, what you really need is some sort of certification or a sense of legitimacy that you can take to, I mean, one of the journalists, I understand, who is now in court, was barred from a Mayor Bloomberg press conference because he didn't have the proper credentials. I mean, that's nonsense. I mean, you need to have, we need to have some sort of certification that says you are who you say you are, and leave it at that. I think probably the best way to do it is to have a group of peers, possibly the New York Press Club, the Deadline Club.
So was it that, do you think it was because no one was willing to take on this task that the NYPD decided that it was going to do it for public safety, or?
No, I think the NYPD did this for what they thought were public safety reasons. But there was nobody else. I mean, there are other organizations which do give press credentials, like the United Nations, for instance. Sure. For covering their organization, which is difficult.
What the regulation says is they use the language spot and breaking news, and Steve's right. You get a working press card, which allows you to go past the police lines. Although, when I was the head of the Civil Liberties Union, we had lots of problems because sometimes those press lines got shrunk and people had problems with that, or the police sometimes would not let the photojournalists take the pictures of a crime scene. But then there's a second category, which is called press identification card. Sure. And that's important. Steve used the word legitimacy. That's very important. Without that card, when you go in, you want to interview someone, how do they know that you're a journalist? So at least the press identification card should be granted very openly to people who gather information and communicate it, even if it's on the blog. When I talked to the mayor's people, they were baffled about what to do with bloggers. The question was, well, what do we do with bloggers? And I said, treat them like journalists. I mean, do you have problems? Do you have press conferences where people can't get in? And second, you're a politician. Wouldn't you love people covering your stuff? Mm-hmm. So instead of the blue room, take it upstairs to the larger room. And they were silent. I find the conversations that I've had about this issue, at least with the people from the Bloomberg administration, baffling, especially, this is the Bloomberg from Bloomberg News, right?
What's the situation in other cities? Who grants the press credentials?
Well, we're trying to figure that out right now.
I don't think there's any consistency. I mean, one of the dangers of having the organization you're covering grant press credentials to cover it is that they can take it away. I mean, I've often been in situations, or friends of mine have been in situations, where if they take a step wrong or if they do something that police don't like, the threat comes back, well,
we'll pull your press credential.
Which is, takes away the whole point of the thing. It's basically, I think why Paul Browne was thinking about putting an end to the whole system itself was because the bureaucratic and political weight of doing this was just too much for his office. And that's quite clear. I think it should be taken out of his office completely, and I think it should be brought into some sort of neutral or standardized group that can really take this and say, you are a legitimate press person, you get this press pass that demonstrates that.
Right. What is legitimate press person?
Right, that's the question. We raise in the lawsuit that language like that is vague, and it allows for unfettered discretion, especially we have at least 2 of the 3 people who have been critical in the NYPD, and it's a possibility as we do discovery that when we get the list of who gets the credentials, who doesn't, that people who are critical of the NYPD or the Bloomberg administration have not been getting it. So you got to be very careful about the criteria so that it really is objective and neutral.
I do
Steve,
agree.
One question though, can we as journalists do our job without this piece of identification?
Certainly we can. If you're a good journalist, you can get around any bureaucratic obstacle. But I want to address Norm's point, because there isn't the issue of legitimacy. While it does create certain problems, there also is, I mean, I have been at many press events and wars or civil conflicts throughout my career where there are people who join in to the coverage who are not journalists at all. And in one sense, that brings down the rest of the profession, where these people are either there for their ideologues or they're there to push a case, and people who crash press conferences, for instance. So there is a legitimate worry that there are people out there who like to claim they're press people but are not that at all. So there has to be some happy medium. I agree with Norm that legitimacy is very hard to define, but very often your peers themselves can say, you work for a news organization, you work for a blog, you work for an online, then you are accepted as a journalist. And I think the traditional journalists should not be the only ones who obviously give this, so new media should be part of the legitimizing process.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. Norman Siegel, Steve Handelman, thank you for coming in.
It's a pleasure.
We'll take a break and be right back.
Journalism is about telling stories, true stories about real people. And in my experience, real life is far more compelling than fiction. I'm Linda Prout, and I've been a journalist for 25 years and a teacher of journalism for 16. There are many ways to tell a story. I started in radio, moved to television, then to print, but I was drawn back to broadcasting. Maybe that's because I come from a tradition of oral storytelling. I've traveled and worked all over the world, and similar traditions exist everywhere. People passing on stories about the events of the day, about events in their lives. And that's what broadcast journalism does, albeit in a more structured way. Radio is still how many people first learn about the stories of the day, whether it's a New Yorker tuning into all news radio, or a farmer in Haiti who has access to news only via radio. Combine images with the spoken word, and television can sometimes transcend language and cultural barriers. So I teach students to write stories, and the operative word is write. Write stories that truly and clearly speak to people, whether the story has the brevity of breaking news or the depth of a documentary. You'll learn this at the CUNY J School, from experienced professors and from professionals from the industry. And you'll learn this in New York, home to dozens of commercial, community, and cable stations. So if you're serious about broadcast journalism, this should speak to you.
The NYPD isn't the only police department being sued by a journalist. A lawsuit brought by newspaper publisher Roberto Lima against the Newark, New Jersey Police Department is still pending. We end our show with this backgrounder on the case by producer Michelle Garcia.
Newark, a city too often known for violent crimes that make headlines. It was September 2007 when a freelance photographer named Geraldo Carlos discovered among the trash and debris under the Pulaski Skyway a dead body.
The body was over there.
Carlos ran with the news straight to the editor of the Brazilian Voice, Roberto Lima.
I went back there with him. I wanted to make a picture of him showing the pile where he found the woman. I told my guys, look, let's go back to the paper. Let's save these pictures and let's go to the police station. So we went there. We told them about the body. We took them, to the place where the body was. Everything was normal. In a situation like this, they showed appreciation that we were helping them doing their job until a particular gentleman came.
The officer was Deputy Chief Samuel DeMeo. And what happened next led to a federal lawsuit against the Newark Police Department and some of the department's top brass.
He gave me straight to my photographer, asking me if he was living legally here in this country.
This just weeks after the state attorney general issued a directive barring law enforcement officers from asking witnesses to a crime about their immigration status. Lima, a U.S. citizen, says he came to the defense of his photographer, who is in the country illegally.
So he told his detective to take his camera. Then he turned to me and he said, "You're not printing this." And that that was very disturbing because I'm a journalist. This is what I do for a living. I told him, look, of course I'm printing this. And then he looking at me funny, and he told me, you know, I got your camera. And, you know, and I told him that I got copies of it. So this is how the whole thing started.
2 days later, the headline in the Brazilian Voice: photographer finds woman's body. There was no mention of the police incident.
I waited for them, you know, to reach out to me and explain to me, you know, why are you guys doing this, you know.
The Brazilian Voice is based in the ironbound section of Newark. This is where Lima launched the Brazilian Voice some 24 years ago, when Brazil was still ruled by a military dictatorship. But it was in the United States where Lima says police trampled on his constitutional rights. Lawyers for the American Civil Liberties Union and Seton Hall University's law school, based in downtown Newark, took up his case.
It's wrong for government officials to tell journalists what to print. It's just wrong in this country. It's unconstitutional.
The Newark Police Department declined to be interviewed or to issue a statement. But in a written response to the court, the police officers deny arresting Lima, but they admit to confiscating the camera without a warrant and telling Lima not to publish the photographs. Attorney General Ann Milgram spoke to Newark radio station WBGO about the case.
What we've done is we've actually stepped into that. We've conducted the internal affairs investigation for the Newark Police Department on this issue. No one who's a victim or witness or somebody who's assisting police can be asked about their immigration status.
After the investigation, Milgram concluded that Deputy Chief DeMeo had violated her directive. The Attorney General's office confirmed that the Newark Police Department issued DeMeo a written reprimand. Small newspapers run by immigrants. Lima says he wants to take a stand for them and to send a message with his lawsuit.
I don't want a journalist from a small newspaper to be treated like that. And I think this is a good situation to make an example out of it. And if cops know, if police officers know they cannot do it because they will be held responsible, they would think twice. They would never do it if it was a reporter from the Star-Ledger or the New York Times, I'm pretty sure.
For independent sources, I'm Michelle García.
Lawyers for Lima expect the suit to be settled early next year.
That's our show. Thanks for watching us, and we'll see you next week.
In the meantime, be independent-minded.